Okay, let's go ahead and get started here. I am Jeff Martin. I'm the Director of Communications and Public Affairs at the American Anthropological Association. I am an older white male, as evidenced by my graying brown hair, and I am wearing black framed glasses and I'm wearing a white collared shirt, and I'm reporting to you from the wonderful confines of my bedroom. Welcome to the art of the art of article manuscript preparation. This is the second of a four-part webinar series hosted by the Society for Medical Anthropology and the Society for Psychological Anthropology. I do want to note that there will be two more webinars by SMA and SPA in April and in May, one on anthropology outside of the academy and one on grant writing for dissertations and beyond. I'd also like to point out that the AAA is also hosting the Pathways to Careers webinar series running through April. And you can find all of these webinars on the AAA webinar page, which I've just posted in the chat room. So there's a link there. All of these webinars, all of the webinars coming up will be on Thursdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Back to this webinar. To make this webinar more accessible for everyone, we're providing closed captionings. And for closed captioning, if you would like to have that, move your cursor to the bottom of your Zoom screen and you'll see the icon. Click on it and it should appear. Presenters will be providing visual descriptions of themselves and any information that they'll be going over. I would also like to remind the presenters to please announce themselves before they speak. Also a reminder to all of you out there to turn off your video and mute your microphone unless you're speaking. And what's wonderful, we are so Zoom ready nowadays that I see most of you have already done that. So thank you for doing that. If you have questions, now we want to keep this as conversational as possible. So if you have questions, the presenters said that they will take them as they come. We're not going to have a question and answer at the end. We will have a question and answer at the end, but it's going to be kind of free flowing. So if you have a question, please put it into the chat room. It helps if you put question first, question colon, and then ask your question. And they will be taking it up as the questions come in. So again, we want to make this as conversational as possible. So keep that in mind. Without any further ado, let me introduce Dick Powers.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So this is Dick. I'm a white 35-year-old male, short brown hair, black and green framed glasses, septum piercing, haven't shaven in a couple days, wool sweater. You might hear my cats. And I'm calling from St. Louis. I'm a postdoc fellow at the University of South Florida College of Public Health. And I'm the liaison from the Medical Anthropology Student Association to the executive board of the Society for Medical Anthropology. So I'm going to let Rebecca and Matthew introduce themselves, and then we'll get into some questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Lester. I'm a middle-aged white woman with long, kind of reddish curly hair. I'm wearing a black shirt and sweater. And I am zooming in from St. Louis from my home office. I am professor of anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm also currently the president of the Society for Psychological Anthropology, and I'm also the editor-in-chief of the journal Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry.
Hi, everyone. This is Matthew Wolfmeier. I'm a middle-aged white man coming to you from my home office. I'm bald. I've got some black thin-framed glasses, a checked shirt, and I'm even wearing a tie today. And I am the SMA's mentoring and membership chair.
Great. So I want to start with a very broad question, which is how we put together a good article. What is a good article? I know both of you have edited, peer-reviewed, published And so I know you should probably have this down. What is a good article?
There's a lot of things that can make up a good article, but a couple things that come immediately to mind is that there's a clear problem or question at the center of the article. And we can talk more about like what that means, but that you've got a clear problem or question that you are asking, you are able to say why that's a relevant problem or question in terms of theory or the broader field or something beyond your specific ethnographic setting, that you're able to answer your own question in some way, and that you're as clear as possible. I mean, there are a number of articles that come across my desk that have a lot of merit to them, and there's a lot of good stuff in there, but they're really obtuse, and you have to work very hard to try to figure out what the argument is, and people don't want to do that. So don't be afraid to be really straightforward and clear, but having that problem or question, answering that problem or question, and providing enough ethnographic data to support your reasoning for how you get from A to B would be some of the key elements. I'm sure I'm leaving out some, but those are some of the ones that come to mind first.
This is Matthew. I'll totally agree with Rebecca, and suggest that one of the things that I learned that was difficult in its own way was that a good article manuscript really starts with one idea and one case, and that might be a little bit reductive sounding, but when Rebecca says, like, being motivated by a question, I really think about that as being motivated by like one idea, right? It could be your idea, it can be somebody else's idea, but you want some anchor there, right? And that doesn't mean that other ideas can't come in. I think, the best articles open up one idea with another idea, but you want one clear sense of what you're shooting at. And then also, I think you want a sense of what the best evidence that you have to support that idea is, right? And it might be one ethnographic anecdote, it might be an interview segment, it is realistically probably pretty small because most anthropology articles are not that long. And that's not to say it's the only evidence that you would use, but it's the kind of lead or center evidence. And then you would have other stuff drawn from the rest of your work that would support that evidence, right? I think often, and I suffered from this early in my publishing career, I would take a kind of kitchen sink approach to writing an article, whereas like, I'm going to throw so many ideas and all sorts of evidence into this thing. And it is really difficult to read as a peer reviewer to get that kind of stuff because you're not sure what the most important stuff in the article is. And it's really difficult to revise because you feel like all of it is really important, when in reality, just one of those things is really important. And probably one of those like ethnographic cases is really important, and everything else can be pared away and then rebuilt around that stuff.
One kind of formula, and there are many, but one that I found that worked for me in trying to sift through this kitchen sink thing, which I also struggled with, I think everybody does, is to approach it, again, this is one way, but approach it with like, here's this interesting thing in the world that's happening. And we would think, based on what we know and what other people have written before, that it would lead to this, or it would mean this, or people would interpret it this way, but they don't, or it doesn't. Something that's counterintuitive. And then you're unpacking that throughout the article about, well, why? Why is it different than what we would have expected? And then at the end, you can talk about, well, now that we know this is different than what we expected, what does that tell us about theory? How do we have to rethink, or our concepts, our categories, whatever the case may be, our methods? So that's one way of kind of narrowing it down to one thing from your field work that just caught your attention because it's incongruous with what you would have expected, or what we would expect based on the literature that's out there.
So you both have mentioned being very clear, and I'm going to sort of get into the weeds here on what that means, because I think in graduate school, we often fall into a pattern of a lot of signposting. And we don't see a lot of that in articles, see it sometimes. I wonder if that changes throughout the career, but what is the rule of thumb around signposting? So, or in other words, saying very clearly at the start, I'm going to do these things, I'm going to argue these things, I'm going to conclude these things, and then doing those things.
I personally tend to use a lot of signposting still in my writing. I don't know how necessary that is, and different people have different styles. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about it, but I especially like it in the beginning of an article because it gives you a sense of what you're going to be getting and what you should look out for. As long as it's not too much, but enough to give people a sense of, okay, in the next 20 pages, this is kind of the sequence of things I'm going to get and how the author thinks they fit together. But that's just my opinion. Other people don't use it as much. I don't know about Matthew, what you think.
Yeah, this is Matthew. I think that, like Rebecca said, some signposting in the introduction is really important, right? That like you really want to, and especially for peer review, you want to tell your reader what to expect over the next several pages because it tells them what you imagine the article is doing, right? And I think that kind of reverse signposting in a conclusion, although kind of banal, is also really helpful because it reminds your reviewer of what they just read, right? And they can work from there to make sure that their experience is what you intended it to be. I think the other thing that the other kind of signposting that some people tend to do is a kind of citational signposting throughout an article, which is often in the form of like, this is like such and such. And that to me is often more of a distraction than it is help, because I find that kind of citational practice to be distracting. Like even it distracts from the continuity of the author's argument, because it's always casting me to think like, is it like that thing that this person is citing? And I think that's one of those skills that we learn in graduate school, where we want to demonstrate our knowledge of a vast body of literature. But when it comes to writing an article manuscript, you don't need a vast body of literature. You need a pretty narrowly targeted one, which should be represented in any lit review that you do. And I think if you're impelled to make that kind of like, this is like something else citation, that the best place to do that is in footnotes. And actually be able to tell your reader why that's a relevant citation in that moment. I think if it's just like a parenthetical citation, it doesn't do the work that most authors want it to do. But if it's in a footnote and it works, that's great. If it doesn't work, then you can just snip those footnotes out when it comes time to meet a word limit.
So we have a question, and it sort of relates to another question that I had. This is, it says, I totally get that one argument should be centered, and it would be okay that your case study makes not only an anthropological theoretical argument, but also a historical argument that challenges the normative historical narratives of your field. Is it okay to highlight explicitly up front that my case will contribute to both distinct areas?
This is Rebecca. Yeah, I responded in the chat, but I'll say it here too. Yes, I think you can absolutely do both of those things. And I think it's good to signpost that in the introduction, that your argument is talking theoretically or talking about anthropological stuff, and you're also, as a part of that, challenging these other categories or these other narratives. And so yes, you can absolutely, in my view, do that, as long as you're clear about it. And I think being explicit is good so that people understand, oh, okay, I need to keep an eye out for that thread as well, or they won't be surprised when they come across it later in the article.
Yeah, this is Matthew. I would just totally agree with Rebecca and emphasize the importance of not surprising people. That often I have read stuff, and I've probably written it too, where like I save part of the contribution until the conclusion, and inevitably peer reviewers are like, that should be in your introduction, right? And because if it is a contribution, you want to be working with it throughout the entire piece. You don't want to leave it until the last couple of pages, right? And so I think having a clear sense of all of the contributions that you're working toward at the outset is really important for guiding your reader through what they're going to encounter in the manuscript.
So that related to another question I had about something that you were saying, Matthew, about the kitchen sink approach. And it just reminded me, I had a bad experience. Maybe a year and a half ago, I was working on my dissertation. I wanted to get a publication out. I took a dissertation chapter, and we can sort of bracket moving from dissertation chapters into articles, because I do want to talk about that. But I took this dissertation chapter, I sort of lightly edited it and sent it off to a journal, an anthropology journal, and they kicked it back in like 3 days and said, it's not for us. You should try this area studies journal. So I kicked it off to the area studies journal. They also said, this doesn't work for us, but they gave me pages and pages of very generous feedback. And overall said it was doing too much. I was making too many arguments or didn't have a clear argument, and I was drawing on too many bodies of literature and all sorts of things, which sounds like a dissertation chapter. And it dawned on me that the reason that I thought it was strong was because this kitchen sink approach was because I was trying to anticipate critique, right? I was trying to anticipate peer reviewers saying, well, what about this thing? Or what about that thing? So how do you sort of balance that out, I guess, if you're trying to make a single streamlined argument from one case and one argument or one idea, while also anticipating those sorts of responses?
So this is Matthew. I think dissertations are really anxious documents, right? And that part of the challenge of writing them, and it's a challenge of reading them too, is that people are trying to signal everything that they know, right? And one of the big tonal shifts between your dissertation and everything else that you do in your life is removing as much of that anxiety as you can, right? You can't possibly anticipate everything that your peer reviewers are going to respond to your article with, right? And so in some sense, it's better not to anticipate anything, right? That they will tell you what they need, and you will most likely be able to write that up based on your expertise in the field. But I think that if you really think about what you're doing is pretty narrowly focused, and then they'll lead you to the connections that they want to see you make, it allows for like a much more generative peer review process and a revision process. Most articles, like we haven't said it yet, but like most articles are between like 6,000 and 8,000 words. Like there are some journals that take like 10 or 14,000 word article manuscripts, which I recommend strongly against, especially earlier in your career. But when you think about those 6,000 to 8,000 word article manuscripts, they've got to be pretty narrow, right? Your peer reviewers are going to tell you how this speaks to them in their field, right? So if it's a cultural anthropology journal or if it's an area studies journal, right, they're going to try and make those, or want to help you make those connections. Hopefully they're going to do that, right? And if you write them a little more narrow, it means that the process of being rejected from one place and sending it somewhere else is probably a little more streamlined too. Not that I wish that experience on anybody, but like if you try and make it a little more open in some respects, I think that that allows you to reuse it more quickly.
This is Rebecca. Yeah, I would definitely agree with what Matthew just said. And I don't know if we're going to talk about reviewer comments, but one thing I'll say is absolutely expect you're going to get a revise and resubmit, or they might say, this is not right for our journal. I've had that happen to me, certainly. So it's really an opportunity to get feedback from specialists in your field about your work. And so as far as the kitchen sink approach, if you give them too much, they're not going to know what it is that you need feedback on, really. They're just going to say it's too much. And as Matthew was saying, if you err on the side of being too narrow, they can say, we need this fleshed out, or we need to see the links with this. And then you can know more in a more targeted way what to add in the revisions.
Thank you. This is Dick. So this sort of reminds me of conversations I've been having with some colleagues, young scholars, junior scholars, PhD candidates, postdocs, early tenure track, talking about sort of getting an article 90% there and then sending it. And we can use this to talk about reviewer comments and things. Do you think that that's an okay approach to, knowing, sort of depending on the peer review process to help you get it 100%?
This is Rebecca. I guess it depends on what you mean. Do you mean like 90% polished, or what do you mean by that?
Right. Well, there can be some anxiety or writer's block, or something gets in the way from getting it to a point where you're totally satisfied with it, but most of the way there. Something's missing, you're not quite sure what it is. Let's see what the peer reviewers have to say.
I think that's fine, actually. I think that's better than sitting on it for 2 or 3 more years and it not getting done. You don't want it to be so obvious that the peer reviewers are like, I'm not writing this article for you. Why are you sending it to me like this? But if you think it's complete enough that somebody could really engage with it, but you're not sure what really is missing, I think that's a fine thing to do. What do you think, Matthew?
Yeah, this is Matthew. So my general rule is like about when something is ready for peer review is when I can't figure out what to do with it anymore. That like when and that might be the 90% that you're talking about, Dick, right? But that when I get to the point where it's like, okay, I think this is done. I'm not entirely positive that it's done, but I also don't know what to do in order to make it more done than it is. I send it up for peer review. And invariably, people tell me that it's 90% done. That like there is more to do, right? Maybe sometimes even less than 90%. But that like Rebecca said, I think that it doesn't do anybody any good to sit on a manuscript, right? That if you stall out on something, and if it's writer's block or whatever you want to call it, just having it sit on your virtual desk isn't doing you any good. As long as your sentences are all complete and it's like formatted and it looks like an article manuscript should look like, there's no harm in sending it out, right? I think the one of the benefits about blind peer review is that like nobody's going to hold any imperfections in your early manuscripts against you, right? They have no idea who you are. If there's just like a glaring hole or something in an article manuscript, it's not like they're going to continue to think about it years into the future, right? and editors, they should have no bias against you if you send them something that's incomplete and then send something later on, right? Whatever the problems there are with peer review, that is one of the benefits of it. Which is all to say that I think that as long as it's mostly done, it's good enough, right? And you need to be ready for people to say that it's not done, right? But I think if you go into it knowing that it's incomplete in some way, that kind of comment won't be jarring in the way that it might be if you're convinced that you have a masterpiece on your hands and that everything has been neatly put together and it makes perfect sense, right?
This is Dick. So I have a couple more questions from the chat. One of them is about abstracts. What makes a good abstract? What needs to be in an abstract?
So the abstract, you want to give people a snapshot of what the whole article is going to be, obviously. So you want to be able to clearly articulate the question that you're asking or the problem that you're dealing with. You obviously can't put all the ethnographic data in there, but I think a good abstract, sets up this kind of conundrum that the article is going to sift through. So you've got that, and then you're going to tell people what you're going to do to answer it, and you're going to tell them what you come to at the end. I don't know if that's at all helpful, but yeah, just kind of pulling out those main structural pieces of the article and putting them in a narrative and an abstract.
This is Matthew. I'll tell you that every abstract I've written has been rewritten like 10 times. And usually over the course of the peer review process, I have to go back and totally rework an abstract. And that is often because what I imagine the paper to be doing and what it actually does is different. And through the peer review process, it really helps me see exactly what that article is doing. I really try and keep abstracts short. Like sometimes journals let you write 250 or 300 word abstracts, and I really shoot for like the 150 word abstract because one of the lessons I learned in graduate school was from a faculty member named Tom Wolf, who told me to always leave people wanting more. And I think that having an abstract that like raises the questions that Rebecca's talking about, it doesn't give people the sense that they have all of the answer to those questions, actually gets people to read your work, right? That if you tell them too much up front, that you've lost them already. So I think, planning on rewriting, I think that's one of the constant lessons that we're talking about right now. Planning on rewriting is really important for approaching an abstract.
Excellent. This is Dick. Just to share a brief sort of experience of this, I just recently, maybe a week or two ago, had an article accepted. And during the peer review process, I was told that I didn't do what I had promised in the abstract. And I realized that it was because I had written the article, submitted it, and as I was in the submission portal, I was asked to submit an abstract as well, and I hadn't even thought of it until I was submitting. And so I just wrote a very quick summary of what I had written in the article. And it turns out that the abstract had summarized the article better than the article summarized the article. So during the peer review process, I had to go back and I liked the abstract a lot. And so I sort of had to revise so that it stuck to the abstract rather than revising the abstract. And so it was an accident, but now I wonder if I should do that all the time. It's sort of like the saying of, write your introduction last, right? It's sort of the same thing. So we had another question. Where did I put it? Yes, picking our journals. So for the work that sits across subdisciplines, for example, medical and political anthropology, is there a best protocol to see appropriateness or preference for the journal? Is an email to the editor better than forwarding the entire article for review? How do you feel about that?
This is Rebecca. I'll say as the editor of Cultural Medicine and Psychiatry, I get those kind of inquiries very often from authors about, does this look appropriate for your journal? So I welcome that. That saves everybody a bunch of time and hassle. So if you're not sure, I would say absolutely reach out to the editor. I've done that myself as well before going through that whole process. And it was very helpful to get that feedback that, yes, send it to us. We'd like to send it out for review. And then you know, or saying, actually, no, that doesn't really fit our scope. And so then you don't waste your time and months of it going through review or dealing with a rejection that, like what Dick was talking about before, where they just say, no, thank you. So yeah, reach out to the editor for sure.
This is Matthew. I would just add to that it's gonna, like, your mileage will vary by editor. And some editors won't be able to make that decision based on just a cover letter, right? They'll actually want to see the manuscript. And the other thing to really pay attention to, and I think this is one of the lessons that it took me a long time to learn, is how rapidly editorial boards change and editors change, and that priorities between them can be very different, right? So if it's probably more work than you want to do at the outset of trying to find a journal for where you're going to send stuff. But I think that often if you see that a journal is about to replace its editors, that might be a flag for a reason to avoid that journal. The biggest setbacks I have had in article publishing has been during those editorial transitions where either it gets lost in the shuffle or one editorial team has the totally different approach than another editorial team does. That if you find someone who has recently assumed an editorialship, that's probably the safest journal to send stuff to in that moment.
Thank you. This is Dick. So we don't have a whole lot of time left. I'm going to defer to the chat questions. But my last sort of pre-written thought or question was going to be about citational politics. A lot of journals are starting to work in, I don't know if we would call them policies, but sort of guidelines for citational praxis. I'm thinking specifically of feminist anthropology has a very strong guidelines on this. And so I would like to ask what sort of, what you think good strategies are for following those guidelines. And then I'll get into the chat questions.
This is Matthew. I would really encourage people to make sure that when you think about the citational practices that you're engaging in, that they're diverse, right? And that they're sincere. That you can read Kathy Lutz's piece about the erasure of women's writing in anthropology, and the feminist anthropology has a bunch of recommended things for people to check out to think about those citational practices. But I think the danger of throwing in a bunch of citations from people that you're not sincerely engaging with is that it will rub peer reviewers the wrong way, right? And so where it's appropriate, absolutely you should be diversifying your bibliography, right? And until all of that scholarship is really the foundation through which we all are asking our questions, like that's the best that we can probably do. But I think the sincerity of that engagement is really critical too, that you don't want to use those citations as kind of throwaway citations, right? They need to be things like problems that you're working through. But so there, unless Rebecca wants to add to that, I can respond to some of the questions in the chat if you want. There's a couple that are kind of the same about like early career publications. And the I think the vibe from those questions is like, do you publish your big contributions as quickly as you can, or do you hold them back? And I'm not sure that there's a right way to answer that question. I think that often publishing those big contributions is more challenging than you think, and that publishing some smaller stuff first will allow you to work towards publishing that big stuff. Part of that is like self-citation, right? That like when you try and make really big arguments, that you need more evidence than you're going to be allowed to use in a 6,000 or 8,000 word article manuscript, right? Or even a 10,000 word article manuscript. And being able to say, I address this portion of this concern in this other piece will go a long way to ameliorating your peer reviewers' concerns. The other thing, and maybe Rebecca and I can have a future conversation about the difference between like first books and second books, is that I think one of the challenges in publishing your big idea in a standalone article before you publish the book is that it demotivates people from reading the book because they've read the article already. And so if you think about what you're publishing early in your career as the scaffolding and the kind of like infomercials for why people want to read your book, that will like inform what you're choosing to publish in a way that's very different than trying to make some big splashy intervention, right? I think that publishing those big synthetic pieces after you publish the book makes more sense, because then people can read that and go back to the book, right? And I think it's often really useful when you can, use the theoretical framework or, your big contribution with evidence that's not in the book, right? So like after you've published the book, you've got the kind of cutting room floor's worth of scraps that didn't make it in, and you might be able to weave that together in a way that will do work for you to get people to go back to the book.
This is Rebecca. Thank you for that, Matthew. I think I completely agree. That was a very helpful way of putting all of that. I think also, when you're thinking about those initial pieces to be your infomercials, another way to think about it too is when you write your dissertation, you can't possibly put everything in your dissertation that you want to put in there. There might be chapters or parts of chapters or pieces of things that you really wanted to dig into more in the dissertation, but it didn't really fit. Those are also good things to think about turning into articles or conference papers. I do that a lot, or I have done that a lot, where I kind of use a conference presentation to start formulating an idea that's going to eventually be an article that relates to my bigger, big splashy thing, but doesn't give the whole thing away, but gets enough information where people start to get intrigued. And I like what Matthew said about being able to cite yourself both before and after that first book. I think those are both really important parts of it.
This is Dick. I'm scanning the questions, make sure we didn't miss anything here. I'm out of questions. Were there any final thoughts that either of you had?
I wanted to address, there's a question in there about technical language and terms. And I would say, do not expect the reader to go look it up. You have to expect that they will not want to do that. So if they don't understand it, they're just not going to get what you're arguing. So footnotes are your great friends, but a brief, just very brief comment about how you're using that term, even if it is something that's common in anthropology, is very important in the process.
Yeah, this is Matthew again. You have to imagine the context under which people are doing your peer review, right? Which is like in between classes that they teach, or in between caring for their children or whatever. And the prospect of them doing any more work than they absolutely need to is probably, especially in the context of a global pandemic, probably really low, right? So you want to make sure that you give people everything that you think they need to know in order to navigate your piece. And I think, like Rebecca said, even if you're using terms that are commonly used in anthropology, that their common use doesn't necessarily mean that there's consensus. And so you need to make sure that you're like really clear in your definitions and citational uses when you're using those key terms. There's another question in the chat that I'll just, about, is it ever too late to go back to older fieldwork and publish from that? And I would say no, as long as you're not, well, even if you are duplicating stuff that you've published in the past, in terms of evidence, that you can go back to it in the context of emergent debates, right? And revisit it. And I think that there are many elders in our discipline who have led the way in doing that kind of work. But you know, alongside that, I think the critical thing to recognize is that like all ethnographic work is already historical work too, and that it's always about a moment in time. And so as long as you're able to historicize when you were doing that field work and what the context of it was and why it's relevant now, it's totally appropriate to go back to that stuff.
Great. This is Dick. So I think that about wraps it up. I am to remind you that the next webinar that we'll be doing is April 29th on grant writing for dissertations and beyond. This particular webinar has been recorded, and I'm sure you'll all receive a link to that shortly. So until next time.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.